Good afternoon. I'm going to be talking to you about the moral argument, an abductive moral argument for God by David Baggett, presented by Ryan Minner. So, this is by David Baggett. He's presenting an argument for moral obligations that is based on Alvin Plantinga's argument for morality. This argument from natural theology, Alvin considers second to none. What is that argument? Well, there's two formulations of the argument of the moral obligations, and they go like this. The first is the deductive version. Premise 1 of the deductive version says this: there are objective moral obligations. Premise 2 says if there are objective moral obligations, then God exists. And finally, premise 3 says, so God exists. This version is valid, and since it is a valid argument, the only thing left is to figure out if the premises are more likely true than not. So here, the question of whether the premises are more likely true than not is unclear, depending on an individual or a collective reading. On an individual reading, the question is whether or not each premise is more likely true than not. And on the collective reading, the question is whether or not the premise set taken as a whole is more likely true than not. These are very important differences because basically we're saying that each premise could be more likely true than not, but the likelihood that the conclusion is true must be less than 50%. Now, an example of this is by Timothy McGrew, and basically what he's saying is imagine that you take one dice and you roll it. The premise of this would be, the first would be that the roll would yield a 1, 2, 3, or 4. The second premise of this would be that the roll would yield a 3, 4, 5, or 6. And the third premise would be that the roll would yield a 3 or a 4. Now, each premise is more likely true than false, and the conclusions that follow will with certainty from the premises. Now, the deductive version requires a collective reading of the truth of the premises. The conjunction of premise 1 and 2 needs to be more likely true than false, and this is what will ensure that the conclusion is likely true. Now, this is just an example of the deductive version that I just talked about. Now, the second version is the abductive version, right? Now, the first premise of the abductive version is this: there are objective moral obligations. The second premise is the best explanation of objective moral obligations is God. And the third premise is, therefore, probably God exists. Now, what we mean by God here is an Asselmian God, right? So the professor of the omni qualities, right? So he's omnipotent, he's omniscient, he's omnipresent. He's basically the God of what we would call classical theism. Now, this abductive sort of argument is an inference to the best explanation. Now, what this means is there are two different types. So the explanatory scope pertains to how much of the relevant data is explained, and the explanatory power asks how well the facts are explained. Now, let me explain each one of these. This method begins with certain data to be explained, and from a list of possible explanations, it narrows the list down to the best explanation. This is done by an application of a principal set of criteria, which include the explanatory scope and the power scope. And the explanatory scope, as I said here, pertains to how much of the relevant data is explained, and the explanatory power asks how well the facts are explained. Now, this here is wrapping up what I've been talking about, and it shows you here that premise 7 and premise 1 are the same. Premise 7 says there are objective moral obligations, and premise 1 says there are objective moral obligations. Now, notice too that premise 7 is the same as premise 1 in the previous argument. So now we're talking about the two different arguments here, right? So the abductive and the deductive, right? Which reveals that both the deductive and abductive arguments from moral obligation are predicated on the existence of moral of objective moral duties. Now, here we are. So the deductive versus the abductive, right? So in the deductive version, a conditional is affirmed, saying, if there are objective moral obligations, then God exists. Okay? Now, the abductive version argues that God is the best explanation of moral obligations. So, in the deductive version, God's existence is entailed, whereas the abductive version warrants, at least tentatively, an inference to God's existence as the likely true explanation of moral obligations. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you learned something. And thank you, Dr. Baggett. Have a wonderful day. God bless you.